Samantha Power. Hillary Clinton and Susan Power, the three horses of the apocalypse under Obama. When they had the chance, they actually did prevail on Obama to support the regime change operation in Libya, which was couched in humanitarian terms. But all the claims about Gaddafi to justify that intervention were lies. And in the end, it made Libya much worse off in terms of human rights and the standard of living than before. And that's Samantha Power in a nutshell. So it really made sense then she became the head of USAID.
Hello, and welcome to the Global Majority for Peace podcast. I'm Fiona Edwards, and my co-host is Ileana Chan. Every week on this podcast, we discuss with special guests from across the world our mission of building a global movement to challenge the US-led war drive against China, Russia, and countries in the global south. So please do subscribe, like, comment, and share with your friends. We are trying something a little different at the moment to encourage people to become a member of Empire Watch on our Patreon. So we'll be posting the first 30 minutes of this interview on YouTube, and then the full episode will be available for Patreon members to watch in full. So please help sustain our work by becoming members of Patreon today. And as this is a podcast, you can also find it on Spotify and Amazon Music.
And the best part will be in the second half, by the way. That'll be the most exciting part. So.
Spoiler alert for Patreon. So we are so excited today that joining us for the Global Majority for Peace podcast is Daniel Kovalik. Dan Kovalik is an American lawyer and human rights advocate who currently teaches international human rights at the University of Pittsburgh.
No. I lost that job because of my position on Russia. They got rid of it.
Oh, really?
They did not like after the SMO, not the book. I wrote an article saying that Russia had a right of collective self-defense to defend the Donbass. They did not like that. So I don't teach there. I taught there from 2012 to 2023 was my last year. Yeah.
Okay.
But that's fine. Just to be clear. And anyway, it's relevant to our story.
It is relevant. It's really relevant. And you're an author of several books.
Yes, I'm working on my ninth.
Your ninth book.
Right.
Okay, cool. And also, I know one of the books, I think in 2023, was called Cancel This.
Cancel This Book. Yes.
Yeah, so probably quite related to what you just told us, perhaps. Yes. I'm sort of guessing. But also, one of your books includes A No More War: How the West Violates International Law by Using Humanitarian Intervention to Advance Economic and Strategic Interests.
Yes.
Which is what we actually want to start with. So take it away, Fiona.
Yeah, well, welcome on the show. We're really happy to have you on joining us today, Dan. So we wanted to speak about this book, No More War: How the West Violates International Law by Using Humanitarian Intervention to Advance Economic and Strategic Interests. And one of the interesting developments of Trump's return to the White House has been the move to dismantle funding for USAID. So USAID is an instrument of the CIA alongside NED that really pushes this aspect of humanitarian intervention. Granted, the reasons for cutting funding for USAID don't actually acknowledge what USAID really is. However, because of this contradiction between the purpose of this and Trump's over-imperialist rhetoric, there seems to be some confusion about how isolationist and anti-war Trump really is. Can you explain what institutions like USAID and NED are and how they work to justify US intervention?
Yes, NED was actually created in the 1980s. I think the USAID predates that. I think that's an older institution. But in any case, in the early 1970s, there were these Senate committees led by Senator Frank Church. They're called the Church Committee hearings. And they looked into the crimes of the Central Intelligence Agency, overthrowing foreign governments, assassinating foreign leaders, even got into the misdeeds of using LSD to try to manipulate people's minds, etc. And the CIA's reputation was so greatly hurt that they decided essentially to subcontract some of their regime change work to the USAID, and then in the 80s to the newly formed National Endowment for Democracy. And so these organizations, since that time, did a lot of the work that the CIA had done. I mean, the CIA still does that work, but again, that also uses these other institutions who will fund opposition groups in other countries, even fund groups that engage in violence to try to promote regime change. But because they're called USAID and they're called the National Endowment for Democracy, they do it under the appearance of being humanitarian aid organizations. But for the most part, they're not. I mean, they do some of that work, but largely they exist to support regime change operations. I'll just give one example. There's many I could give, but I'll give two examples, one for each organization. So USAID spent a lot of money, and so did the National Endowment for Democracy, for that matter, in 2018, and even before that, to fund opposition groups in Nicaragua that tried to carry out a very violent coup in the summer of 2018, which nearly toppled the government. The exact number of people killed is not clear, but it was something between 200 and 300 people. Very violent. People were raped, and it was a terrible time. And actually, I believe it was the NED's magazine that ended up saying that they took credit for helping lay the groundwork for that insurrection. And that was pretty much their words. So I'll say something a little more specific about the National Endowment for Democracy because I know quite a bit about it. Because I worked for the United Steelworkers Union for 26 years. And you may say, well, what does that have to do with the NED? The NED has three pillars to it. One is the International Democratic Institute. One is the International Republican Institute. So those are the two political parties, main political parties of the U.S. And the third is the AFL-CIO, the main union confederation of the United States of America, which the Steelworkers was a member of. Okay. And so the NED uses those three pillars to do regime change work, including the AFL-CIO, which we on the left jokingly refer to the AFL-CIO as the AFL-CIA, because the AFL-CIO for years engaged in work to help with regime change. One of their famous instances of this was in Chile in 1973. They supported the Teamsters Union there in engaging in strikes to try to bring down the Allende government. So even before the NED existed, the AFL-CIO was engaged in this regime change type operations. I think it must be the only union in the world that does this, right? This is a bizarre thing. Even in Great Britain, that loves to, it has its own colonial past and present. I can't imagine unions doing that. But in the US, the AFL-CIO, since about 1948, has been a collaborator with the State Department and the CIA in working on regime change, which is an incredible thing. And so they got funding starting in the 80s, got a lot of funding through the NED. They had a kind of subgroup, the AFL-CIO, called A Field at that time. It then became the Solidarity Center, the misnamed Solidarity Center. The Solidarity Center, the last big regime change operation that I know they were involved in was in 2002, the coup against Chavez. They played a very instrumental role in that and got NED money to do that. Anyway, I hope I didn't say too much, but what this shows is the US is the biggest regime change actor in the world. And so it has all these different groups throughout society that are involved in those operations. And now to answer what I think the second part of your question was, do we think that Trump, by shutting down the USAID, for example, is showing that he is somehow going to stop these operations or whatnot? And I think you were getting to that point. And the answer to that is no, I don't think so. Because what we think is going to happen, and what I think Marco Rubio, the Secretary of State, suggested was that their regime change operations are just going to be folded into the U.S. State Department. So it'll be a more direct kind of operation because the USAID was getting their marching orders from the State Department anyway. So now it'll just be more a direct thing. And probably the negative, I will say this, probably the negative is that some of the real decent humanitarian work that USAID work will probably die. The bad will continue in the State Department and the good probably won't continue. So it's probably, in truth, an overall bad thing that's happening, but again, looking like it's good because it's being shut down. But again, the bad operations are just going to be brought into the State Department and maybe some even back into the CIA. So, I mean, yeah, I don't think it's anything to cheer. The only thing to cheer is that some information is coming out through all this of what weird things they were funding and that sort of thing. An interesting thing he does is reveal some truths about the U.S. empire. That, he does do that. And that should be welcomed. It doesn't mean he's against the empire, but he's a little more honest about it. You might recall, in fact, that during his first term, he said that the U.S. is in Syria for the oil. We're going to stay there to take the oil. And you might remember that Assad's response to that was that this made Trump the greatest U.S. president, not because of his actions, but because he was actually honest about what the U.S. was doing and why, in a way that other presidents weren't.
That is such an interesting thing. And that's, I think, what fascinated me about this USAID thing, because obviously Trump is using that excuse of, instead of USAID, it's USAID. We shouldn't be providing aid to these people. Like, why are we providing DEI aid to countries when it's always been a cover for, like you're saying, CIA operations around the world, maybe making America seem much more morally superior in the way that they want the world to see them as morally superior. So the fact that he's taking that away is, I know that it's not because he's less imperialistic, but it's just an interesting thing for him to do. It's like they don't need the mask anymore, perhaps.
I think that's part of it. I also think that in this case, with the USAID, I think he doesn't like a lot of these programs. Okay, he doesn't like the DEI programs they're supporting. He doesn't like the LGBTQ programs they're funding. Like, he doesn't like some of those programs. So this will just give him more control over it. Right. I mean, so again, it's not like he's doing this for any sort of inspired or progressive reasons, but again, in the process of it, he is, again, just kind of stirring up some dirt that people see, which is important. I mean, again, whether it's just by accident or whatever, people should at least pay attention, but also should pay attention to now where those operations are going to go into. So, yeah, I mean, I'll also just say that the head of the USAID under Biden was Samantha Power. And I want to talk a little, if you don't mind, if I can digress to talk about her. I think she is probably, for me, the poster child. I don't know if that's the best analogy, but she is the best face of U.S. humanitarian intervention, because she got her whole political career, her entire career, stems from this book she wrote years ago called A Problem from Hell. And it was about genocide in the world. It's about 1,000 pages. And there's a couple things notable about the book. First of all, she doesn't cover any of the U.S. genocides, right? So she doesn't talk about the U.S. genocide in Vietnam or the U.S. genocide in Guatemala, but she always talks about other people's genocides. And what she argues in the book is that a lot of these genocides happen because the U.S. didn't act to stop them. Okay, so the whole assumption of the book was the U.S. is the good guy in the world, and it needs to act more to stop genocide. Again, ignoring the fact that the U.S. commits genocide and supports many genocide. And so the whole thesis of the book was that the U.S. has to actually intervene more in the world militarily. And when she had the chance, she and Clinton, Hillary Clinton and Susan Power, the three horses of the apocalypse under Obama, when they had the chance, they actually did prevail on Obama to support the regime change operation in Libya, which was couched in humanitarian terms. But all the claims about Gaddafi to justify that intervention were lies. And in the end, it made Libya much worse off in terms of human rights and the standard of living than before. And that's Samantha Power in a nutshell. So it really made sense then she became the head of USAID. And she'll land on her feet. I don't know where she is now, but she'll end up back at Harvard, or they'll find a great place for her. Don't cry for Samantha Power. The truth is, she's one of the people I really dislike most in the world. I think she represents the hypocrisy of the U.S. empire in a way no one else does.
I think right there, you're sort of touching upon one of the things that is really apparent to maybe us, which is that it's very bipartisan, right? It's
Yes.
often you hear things like, okay, so the head of state will change, but it's the deep state that is controlling everything. Many people, I think, don't understand what the deep state is. It sort of takes on a mythical feeling to a lot of people, but you've actually written a few books on how the deep state is responsible for overthrowing several governments around the world. Could you actually clarify what the deep state actually is, how it is intertwined with the CIA? What is the deep state?
Well, that's in some of the titles of my books, but I rarely actually use it in kind of discourse. But I think it's a fine term. It's a loaded term, but I think it does have some very legitimate use. And first of all, every country in the world has some kind of deep state. So, what is a deep state? I mean, the simplest way to put it is it's the bureaucracy that exists, the government bureaucracy that exists through different government, right? So, it's the unelected government, part of the government that actually has to exist for a government to survive, right? To actually be able to do work. You can't fire everyone every 4 years and rehire. You just couldn't function, right? Depending on how big the country is. And the US has tens of thousands, I don't know, actually has millions. It has literally millions of bureaucrats who function for many, many years, regardless of who is in power. And so naturally, these institutions, again, represented by in the US, the CIA, the FBI, the State Department, while their heads may change depending on who is in office, their middle and lower tiers don't change at all. Those functionaries continue, and they have their own institutional goals and logic, which don't change that much, regardless of who's in power. And again, there's a good thing to that because that allows a certain continuity, even if you have different leaders. But the negative is it prevents leaders who want to make changes from making those changes. The most classic case is John F. Kennedy. And we'll find this out. Trump is promising to finally release all of the government documents on the Kennedy assassination. But it is greatly believed, and I think there's a lot of evidence, that he was killed by the deep state, by elements of the CIA, for example, who did not like the fact that he was pushing back on the military industrial complex, that he was pushing back on Israel. He wanted to prevent Israel from getting nuclear weapons, for example. He wanted AIPAC, the big Israeli lobbying outfit, to subject to FARA, the Foreign Agent Registration Act from 1938. He wanted them to register as a foreign agent because that's what they are. He wanted to put more limitations on them. He made some suggestion that he wanted to end what was becoming the war in Vietnam. He was able to live with Sukarno in Indonesia. When Johnson took over, and by the way, people think Johnson was part of the coup as well, he allowed the CIA to overthrow Sukarno in Indonesia. They imposed Suharto, who ends up killing 500,000 to 1 million people, mostly communists, right, in a huge genocide. And by the way, Johnson then really ups the war in Vietnam. The war really begins in earnest under him. And Israel's totally let loose. In fact, in 1967, Johnson, through his U.S. ambassador to the United Nations, Goldberg, really helps solidify Israel's occupation of the West Bank in Gaza, in Golan Heights. So all those things seem to have happened because that's what the deep state wanted. And again, Kennedy seemed to be an impediment to that. So that's maybe the best example of how that deep state operates in a very nefarious way to prevent any major change, particularly in U.S. foreign policy. I think that's where the deep state it acts at its worst. And I would say that Kennedy probably was the last true Democratic president, small d, Democratic president of the United States. I really think the Republic died with Kennedy in 1963. Now that we can get into a lot more about that. That's a very provocative statement, but I believe that to be the case.
Just want to expand further on US foreign policy. Trump has brought up talks with Russia, which has led to certain sections of both the left and the right heralding Trump as an anti-war and protectionist. Yet what is often overlooked is the sentiment that's been expressed by the US Secretary of Defense in a recent NATO speech where he called for an increase in military spending from 2% to 5%, claiming, and I quote, "Increasing your commitment to your own security is a down payment for the future and a down payment of peace through strength." So I was wondering if you could unpack that for us and where you think Trump is actually positioning the US in terms of geopolitical alignment.
Yeah, so first of all, it does appear that he wants peace with Russia. I think that's in earnest. I think he does want to wind down the Ukraine war, which I think he did see as Biden's fault. He has said that. He thinks it's Biden's fault and Zelensky's fault. He thinks it never should have happened. And I think he thinks it's a big waste of blood and treasure. So that's a positive thing. I think, though, that it may be a matter of prioritization. I think the Republican Party is more exercised about China than about Russia. I think they want to focus all of the U.S. empire's wrath upon China, which they see as the big threat, not as a military threat, though they claim that to the public to get them to gin up anti-Chinese sentiment. But it's an economic threat. The U.S. cannot compete with China. So it wants to militarily confront it because that's where it thinks it can win. It does not think it can win economically or technologically. So I think it may be a matter of priority over Russia. And in West Asia, I think there's a huge question mark what he's going to do. It does appear he was instrumental in getting the ceasefire in Gaza, which again is welcome. Every day of that ceasefire saves lives. So, I mean, you have to welcome that. But then, of course, then he goes on to say the U.S. is going to take over Gaza and kick out all the Palestinians and turn it into a giant resort. So, though he's backed off that statement a little bit. So, what are his intentions there? We don't know for sure, but I think certainly if he follows through at all with this intention to kick out the Palestinians of Gaza, he will create a regional war. Egypt will get involved, Jordan will get involved. Even Saudi Arabia has said it will make up for any aid that Jordan and Egypt loses if they go to war over that. So it remains to be seen whether he truly is a peacemaker. I mean, I fear again that he is not, and he's just going to make war in other places. Again, though, some of that remains to be seen, and some of it I'd like to think, and I assume this is why you have your show, I'd like to think is up to the American people, right? I mean, that we need to hold our government accountable for these things. I do think the American people don't want these wars. I do think a lot of people who voted for Trump thought they were voting for him because he said he was going to end the wars. And I just hope that when the day most likely comes that he isn't ending those wars, that people are willing to protest and to fight for their principles in wanting to end these wars. Now, there is one interesting thing. I mean, the one thing he did tell the Defense Department is to come up with a plan to cut the budget of the Defense Department by 8% every year for the next 5 years, which I think would ultimately be a budget cut of 35%. That would be huge, right? And he's also talked about trying to negotiate with China and Russia over cutting defense spending by maybe 50%. Of course, the U.S. spends so much more than all countries combined that even a 50% cut will put it way above everyone else, but that would be a start. So again, we'll see. I mean, the thing with Trump is he's all over the place and he contradicts himself. So we just can't know for sure what his plans are. But I think that one certainly has to be skeptical.
You're on the topic of being skeptical. Part of my skepticism is because Elon Musk, we know Elon Musk and Peter Thiel. I actually do not know how many corporations or industries they have, but they have huge parts of that are in the war machine. Considering how much we're seeing of Elon, I'm somewhat skeptical that it would mean, he would have to cut back or funding to him might be cut off, say. So that's like another one of those contradictions, I think, about Trump.
Yeah, and even amongst the people he put in office, like if you look like at a Tulsi Gabbard, who has been good on Syria, good on Russia, she's also a real diehard Zionist. Same thing with RFK Jr. Everyone he has appointed are hardcore Zionists, and Trump's a hardcore Zionist. And his son-in-law is a hardcore Zionist who I think he listens to a lot about Israel. So I can't imagine him backing off on Israel in any kind of way. And look at what Israel's doing right now in the West Bank. It is attacking the West Bank in a way that it never has. It's actually being engaging in aerial bombardments of the West Bank, which was almost unheard of before. I mean, because they have to bomb around Israeli settlements, right? But they're doing it. They're engaged in probably the most aggressive operations in the West Bank they've ever engaged in. Even in Ramallah, which is known as the bubble in Palestine. In fact, a lot of my friends say, I'll say, hey, how you doing? And they're, oh, we're fine. Well, we live in the bubble. Well, that bubble is popping. Israel's popping that bubble. No place is off limits now. And again, Trump is fully supporting that. Also, he has sent those 2,000-pound bombs to Israel, which was the one thing Biden started denying Netanyahu. What are those going to be used for, and where are they going to be used? Again, it's a matter of where are they going to be waging war, not so much whether they're going to be waging war. And I do think people can't be complacent that oh, we can relax because Trump's going to end the war machine. I mean, that would be silly. I mean, even if, like it'd be great too if he cuts down on U.S. military bases in the world. And of course, I support that and want that. But I think wars are going to be fought differently than they have been in the future. We just may not need that sort of presence like we have at the moment. So again, I think you will have a big retooling of what the U.S. military is. And that's where, again, Elon Musk may be important. AI may be used a lot more, and cyber attacks and that sort of thing. So, yeah, I think there's things happening at a breakneck pace that we need to certainly keep our eyes on. So,
you did already mention this, but I'm just curious about this one thing. You mentioned, and I do agree, and I've seen even during campaigning that JD Vance, for example, was like, let's stop funding the war in Ukraine. We've got to focus on China. Like there was so much talk about let's focus on China. But with China being maybe one of the most genuinely economically sovereign countries that we've got, do you see any of the playbook, like the typical deep state CIA playbook, being used? Because even though Marco Rubio, for example, is saying that Taiwan will be invaded by 2030, I mean, there's so much rhetoric that suggests the need for militaristic intervention, etc. Like what? But like what you were saying, it seems like more of an economic competition type of thing. I'm just curious if you are seeing any of those, the same sort of playbook when it comes to China, because I know that American public seems to be quite anti-Chinese.
yes, well, I think there is a certain anti-Chinese sentiment. Again, having worked for the steelworkers for years, they were very anti-Japanese for years because Japan was a very strong U.S. competitor, particularly in the auto industry. Now they've been totally eclipsed by China, so then the steelworkers became very anti-China to the point of being really racist, I would say, about the Chinese. And again, I think that's significant that you have union. These are supposed to be more enlightened institutions that are very anti-Chinese. I think there is a huge anti-Chinese sentiment that's been promoted in many different ways in the United States. And I agree. If you look at the polls, people are actually not that troubled by Russia. Most people don't think Russia's a threat, but most people do think China's a threat. And yeah, of course, the playbook will be very similar. I think the U.S. is going to use Taiwan in the same way they use Ukraine as a proxy against China. I think it was Mao Zedong that actually compared not Ukraine and Taiwan, but Israel and Taiwan. So that, Israel plays the same role in the Middle East as Taiwan does in Asia to counter the adversaries of the United States. So, yeah, I mean, I think that playbook is going to be probably run the same way. Now, the Chinese are very smart, I think. I think Xi Jinping is very smart. I mean, I think they know this is coming or could be coming and going to do what they have to prevent it somehow, right? And I think they won't be provoked into a war with Taiwan in the same way that Putin was provoked in Ukraine. I don't think Xi Jinping thought it was a good idea what Putin did, to be honest. So we'll see. But I do think China is the next big target. That's very, very clear.
Yeah, 100%. I mean, that's the thing we have to kind of overcome is all of that anti-China rhetoric, because China presents no threat really to Western countries, the United States and Europe, and yet you've just got a constant media propaganda to suggest that that is the case. And it's just absolutely ludicrous, really. So that's really got our work cut out in the anti-war movement to clarify that, I think.
Yeah, their big threat is to build speed trains, which I welcome. We could use a few speed trains. I would bow to my Chinese overlords if they would build us some speed trains.
Well, yeah, I mean, the high-speed trains, the renewable energy, all these things actually would be
It's
very useful
incredible what
to
they're doing.
save humanity from climate
Yeah.
change as well. But of course, this is all demonized as well. So it's
No, that's the incredible thing. That's like somehow a speed train's a threat. I mean, it's actually insane. Jimmy Carter, you probably know this, he actually had a call with Trump. Trump called him during his first term to talk about China. And Jimmy Carter said, I think, one of the most profoundly correct things. He told Trump, he said, well, China hasn't been at war since 1979. The U.S. has been at war nearly every year of its existence. And he says, that's why China has speed trains and we don't. He said to Trump, where are your speed trains? Well, we don't have any because all the money's been put into armaments, right? And that's so true. I mean, I just have to say, when I think about China, I am in total awe of what China's done. When I was a kid, all the news footage we saw of China was of people riding bicycles. No one had cars. Within a few decades, they have had the greatest economic and technological development known to humankind. I mean, to me, they should be applauded. Unbelievable what they've done. Instead, as you say, they've been pilloried. And by the way, the U.S. didn't like them when they were riding bikes, and now they don't like them when they have cars. It doesn't matter. They just don't like China. And this goes back years and years and years, obviously, centuries, to this anti-Chinese sentiment of the West. And all for the same reason. They don't want China to rise. They didn't want China to rise, and now that it did rise, they really resent the heck out of it.
Thank you so much for watching part 1 of our interview with Dan Kovalik. Catch the full episode on Patreon. See you next time.